Hi everyone, today I'm pleased to announce that this is my very first project as part of the Rubber Dance design team. I was really excited to be selected for this and I've been itching to get started and to get my hands on these gorgeous stamps. Rubber Dance is a stamp company based in Norway and they make red rubber stamps, and you'll see in this video what a gorgeous impression that you get from them, and I'm looking forward to showing you what I'm going to do with my first set of stamps, and I look forward to sharing more projects using these stamps with you in the future. So my first project is going to be the seashells card, and I'm using the Beach Sentiment set, which is BM16F, and I'll give you the links to Rubber Dance at the end of this video. This is the card that I'm going to be making, and I'm going to be showing you some fun inky techniques and how gorgeously these stamps work. So when I was having a look at the stamps, I stamped out this index card. So you can see this stamp set, Beach Sentiments, comes with two lovely sort of quotes or sentiments and two shell impressions. And I'm going to be using one of the shells and one of the sentiments on this card. So as I said before, Rubber Dance stamps are red rubber and they come to you unmounted, and it's up to you whether you choose to mount them or not. Normally I would mount my rubber stamps, but I'm quite glad that I didn't have any U-mount to do this with before I made this video, because I want to show you what a lovely impression you get whether you choose to mount them or not. So I'm just going to glue them to my acrylic blocks using a little bit of Pritt stick glue, and I'm just making sure that my sentiment is straight, that obviously because I want to be able to know that that's going to be straight when I stamp with it. And I'm also going to only be using one of the shells, but I didn't really realise that at this time, so they're both going to get stuck onto an acrylic block so that I'm ready to get started. So a couple of things before I get started. Excuse the inky fingers, I've already been playing a little bit with something else, so I've got a little bit messy, but I'm going to try not to get that on my white card, as I tend to do. I see a piece of white card, I've got to just smudge it or splodge it with something. So I will be telling you the measurements for this card as I go along, but if you want a full list, a cutting guide, then pop along to my blog, and I will give you a link to my blog post at the end of this video so that you can pick up that cutting guide if you want to make this card for yourself, and I hope that you do. And so now we're going to be working at inking up our cardstock. Using my distress inks to add the colour to my cardstock, and I'm starting out by taking my ink blending tool and swirling brushed corduroy along the bottom edge of my card. So I'm creating the sand at the moment, so I'm just going along the long edge at the bottom and I'm brushing the ink onto the cardstock. So I'm swirling the ink blending tool onto the card. So I'm using an ink blending tool to do this, and I'm working on a craft mat. So this is a slippy surface that allows me to blend the ink onto the edge of the cardstock, and you do that by, as if you're polishing a surface, you're just swirling the brush corduroy onto the edge of the card and blending it towards the centre. So the first piece of cardstock I'm working on measures 7 inches by 4 3/4 inches, and if you're working in centimetres, it's 18 centimetres by 12 centimetres. So once I've got roughly just not quite a half, it's probably more like a third in the frayed burlap, now I'm working with broken china, and I'm going to do the same thing again, blending from the outside to the inside of the card. So when you put your applicator down, you're just going to angle it slightly, so you're just tipping it back on itself, and that helps you to catch the edge of the cardstock, and you're just using a swirling motion to blend that ink into the centre of the card. So I'm just going to keep working at this until I get a lovely smooth finish, and you can see I've just used a scrap piece of paper to hold on to this piece of cardstock, because if you don't, you'll get fingerprints on the ink that you've already laid down. So I'm just coming back over to the other side again, just blending. I'm not adding any ink now, I'm just using the swirling motion to blend the two inks in towards the centre. So you should be looking to achieve something that looks a little bit like a beach. To make the card base, you want a piece of cardstock that measures 11.5 inches by 8 inches, and you're going to score it in half at 5¾ inches. And if you're working in centimetres, you want a piece of cardstock that measures 29 inches by 20.5 inches, and again you're going to score that at 14.5 inches, and that makes our card base. Now, because I'm working on white cardstock and I'm working on the actual card, I'm going to be using this piece of scrap paper to keep the back of my card clean. So I'm just holding my card onto that piece of paper, keeping the edges level. The edge that I'll be working on is going to be on the edge of the paper. Again, I'm going to be needing my scrap card to keep hold of this piece of paper. And I'm just laying the first piece of cardstock that we coloured on top, and I'm just working out where I had the brown and blue meet, and I'm just marking it slightly with, you could do it with a pencil, but I'm just using my fingernail. So I'm just getting an idea of where to take the colour, because I'm going to repeat that process on the actual card base itself, but this time I'm going to try and keep the colour much lighter. So be careful as you start to apply it. Don't go straight in with an immense amount of pressure. Just gradually build up that colour and just keep circling that colour onto the edge of the card, and you're roughly going up to the same point on the card front as you did on the panel that you have just inked. But you can see I'm keeping it much lighter. I'm not too worried about the middle of the card because obviously it's going to be covered up by the cardstock, the piece of card that we've just made. So just keep your touch nice and light as you swirl on the brush corduroy. You're hardly inking up the ink blending tool at all. Just keep it nice and light and gradually build up that colour. So you can see here the difference in the intensity of colour on both pieces of cardstock. And then I'm ready to flick the card around and work on the other side. So hopefully that scrap paper will keep the back of my card clean. Don't forget, as I nearly did, to clean up in between your colours so that you don't blend the brown onto the blue. And then I'm going to repeat that process using the Broken China Distress ink, again keeping it nice and light around the edge of the card. So this is the effect so far, the lighter outside area and the darker centre panel. And now we're going to repeat that process with using that light touch on the inside of the card, just to give a frame to the area that we'll be stamping a greeting later on. So distress ink can stay a little bit wet, so in order to make sure that my ink doesn't transfer on the inside of the card, I'm going to just use a piece of scrap paper just to protect the card from the ink. So I'm folding the front to the inside, and then make sure that you ink the right portion of card. So I've just had to double check myself, and then you're going to repeat the process that you did on the front of the card, keeping it nice and light and keeping the proportions the same. You're just going to ink one half of the card with the brushed corduroy and the other half with, or the other, I suppose 2/3 really, with the Broken China. So this just gives a nice finish to the card. It means you don't have to attach an inner to the card and you can stamp your greeting. I'm not actually going to stamp a greeting in my card because I don't know who I'm going to give it to yet. So I'm just going to create the area ready for when I do want to stamp either a birthday greeting or something else, maybe a thank you. And then again, make sure you keep that piece of card inside. Clean up your craft mat before switching colours. And then I'm going lightly around the rest of the card, or the inside of the card, with the Broken China. We've got a colour on the inside of the card, and we've also got the colour on the front of the card, and I'm managing actually to keep the back clean, which is quite unusual for me. And we've got this darker panel that's going to be on the front of the card, and now we're going to add some texture. So I'm going to start out with some water. So here's my pot of water, and I'm just going to flick small droplets of water onto my distress ink. And if you've used distress ink before, you'll know that distress ink reacts to water. So I'm just making sure that my fingers aren't going to flick blue ink onto my card, and they're not. So I'm just taking a piece of kitchen roll, and you can see the little splatters appearing as the water lifts some of the ink from the front of the card. So I'm just gently flicking water over the card. I don't want anything too big, I'm just trying to create little splatters just to start creating a little bit of texture on this panel. So just keep working until you're happy with the effect. So once you're happy with the amount of splatters you've got, then you're ready to move on to the next section. So I'm going to cover up the top of the card with a piece of scrap paper, and I've got a puddle of, this time I'm using a slightly darker ink. This is Gathered Twigs, and I've got a scruffy brush, and then I'm just dipping it into my little puddle of ink and then flicking it. So I'm just creating tiny splatters. I know it's not showing very much on camera here, but you'll get a better look in a moment. And you're just going to gently splatter small drops of ink onto your sand area of your card. So this time I'm getting a little bit more heavy-handed with the ink, and you need a damp brush when you do this. I think this is what my problem was to start with. My brush was quite dry and I should have started with it damp, but believe me, there are little tiny speckles starting to appear on my card base. And you definitely don't want to do this if you've got anything lying around, because it does splatter quite far. And we're not going to do the water process on the lighter sections that we've inked because it wouldn't show up, but we are going to do the splattering. So you can see here I'm getting much more adventurous with the ink. I know I need plenty more ink, and you can always test this on a piece of paper so you get the feel for it, to see how much ink you're actually going to splatter onto your card. And my card is peeing open, so I'm just using the pot to hold it closed, and then I'm flicking. You're going to hold your brush with one hand and flick your finger across the bristles with the other, and you can see here a little bit better because this cardstock is lighter, that those little tiny dots are starting to appear. And then we've got our inside section. I'm just this time just protecting the white part of the cardstock with my scrap paper, and I'm not too worried because this is the inside of the card. I'm quite happy to have the speckles moving further up out of the sand section. So you can see the speckles there. And again, you're going to need to clean up as you go. I've decided to add a little bit more onto my sand section now that I'm getting better splatter because my brush is wetter. To make sure you clean up all those little teeny tiny dots, and this time I'm working with Salty Ocean, which is a darker blue. And because I've been using my brush already, it's wet. If it's too wet, just dry it off on a piece of kitchen roll. You can see I've got slightly bigger splatters there, which is probably bigger than I wanted. So I've just dried my brush off a little bit on kitchen roll, and then I'm going to carry on flicking the splatters across the blue area of the cardstock. So definitely, if you've never tried it before, just have a little feel on a piece of scrap paper to see what you're going to get. And that's my piece so far. And you can see it just brings a nice texture to the piece. And then I'm going to repeat that, cleaning up in between, because I definitely don't want to get splatters onto my card where I don't want it. So I'm just going to mask off the front section of the card again on the brown, and then flicking just gentle little tiny spots on the front of the card, and then repeating on the inside of the card. So it's just a case of working out which piece goes where when you're masking things off so that you don't get it everywhere. And this time I'm just marking off the bottom section, or masking off the bottom section, and again flicking in or flicking the paint with my paintbrush. So we're getting ready to stamp our sentiment next. I've got a piece of cardstock that I'm just going to place in position where I'm going to put it on the card, and I'm just marking again with my fingernail just roughly where that brown ends and the blue begins. And again, I'm just taking the broken china distress ink around the top area just very, very lightly, and the brush corduroy around the bottom. And when I do this, I'm just creating a little frame ready to stamp my sentiment. So the piece of cardstock measures 2 inches by 3 3/4 inches, and that makes 5 centimetres by 9.5 centimetres. So you can see how I'm matching up the areas of colour, and then I'm going to come back in and I'm going to do a little bit of splattering, just keeping it nice and light. So just making sure I haven't got too much water on my brush. And I'm starting out at quite a distance and then moving in once I'm sure that I'm not going to get huge splatters. So I'm coming in from the brown side with the gathered twigs, and then I'm going to come in from the other side with the salty ocean. So it's just creating a little bit of texture, taking a little bit of that whiteness off the little card that I'm going to be stamping the greeting onto. So loading up my brush and then just flicking with the blue. So the beauty of inking and stamping is that you can make your embellishments match your project. And I've got a little bit of American seam binding here, and it's in a sort of off-white colour, and I'm going to be adding some distress ink to it. So I thought I might just brush it on, but it's I think it's not going to come out dark enough. So I'm using the brushed corduroy, and I'm going to be using the broken china, but I'm going to apply the colours one at a time. You can put them down together, but I like to do them singly so I can just have a little bit of control about how much of each colour that I put onto the ribbon. So I've sprayed the little puddle of ink with water, and then I'm just dipping my piece of ribbon randomly into the brown ink, and then repeating with the broken china, spraying it liberally with water, plenty of water because I want it quite light. If you put less water, you'll get a darker intensity of colour and it won't spread quite as much. So I'm keeping it nice and fluid, and I'm not screwing up my ribbon too much. I don't want it too crinkly, and I'm just going to keep doing that until I'm happy with the colour. It's a little bit light. I'm going to add a little bit more blue. So add the blue to your mat and then spray it with water, and then again just drop your ribbon randomly into the puddle of ink, and you can see I've got a bit more blue here and I'm a bit happier with that. So I'm just drying it off with my heat gun. And be careful not to burn your fingers, and definitely don't put the heat directly onto your craft mat or your sponge mat because you will melt it. So now I'm going to show you how to add texture to your ribbon using your stamps, and I'm going to be using my sentiment stamp to print onto my ribbon. I'm using an archival ink because I don't want it to spread too much. I want to be able to read the writing, and I'm going, it's a colour called Potting Soil, and I'm going to test it against my card. Now I'm thinking it might just be a little bit too dark for what I want, so I'm going to shadow stamp it. So I'm going to stamp it once onto cardstock and then onto the ribbon so I get a slightly lighter print. So I've set up my piece of paper to do my first stamped image onto. I'm keeping my ribbon as flat as it will go, and then I'm just stamping the text. I've sprinkle the sentiment randomly along the length of the ribbon. And you can see by stamping it once on the paper, it's not as dark on the ribbon, but it's still quite legible. And that's because the archival ink doesn't spread as much because it dries fairly quickly. If you did the same thing with distress ink, you would still get a print, but you'd find that over a little while it would bleed into the ribbon, so it wouldn't be quite so defined. So continue all the way along your ribbon, stamping first onto a piece of paper and then onto your ribbon, making sure that you don't turn your stamp round in the meantime and end up with some of the text upside down. I don't mind if I get the odd dark bit, it just adds to the charm. I'm just trying to get that printed texture across the length of the ribbon. And then it's time to stamp the sentiment onto the little piece of cardstock that we prepared earlier. So again, I'm using the archival ink. It's a Wendy Vecchi colour, it's called Potting Soil. It's new to my collection because normally I do stamp in black, and I just thought it'd just make a nice change to stamp in the brown. It's not quite as harsh, but it's still quite good definition, particularly if you're using the stamping images to be coloured in. So I've stamped my sentiment into the middle of my piece of card, and I'm ready to stamp some shells. I think you can see quite clearly on camera how well these stamps work. Look at that gorgeous detail on that shell, and that's when I fell in love with this particular shell, and that's the one I'm going to use on my card. So I've stamped 5 of the stripy shells onto some cardstock, and I'm going to shadow stamp 5 of the shells onto the inside of my card. So I'm starting in the middle, or there or thereabouts, and then I'm going to stamp them right along the bottom of the inside of the card. So I'm just creating a little bit of a border along the bottom edge of the card. So I'm stamping on my scrap piece of paper first, and then I'm stamping onto my card. You can see how much paler that secondary image is, and it's just perfect for the inside of the card. So I'm zooming in a little bit so I can give you a bit of detail on how I use my distress inks as watercolours, and they blend very, very nicely. They work very well as watercolours, and I'm just adding some of the ink to my craft mat. So I've got the broken china and the brushed corduroy. So I'm just adding a little bit more brushed corduroy. And then I'm wetting my brush and loading up the brush with the broken china ink. So I'm just using it like a palette, and then I'm using my brush, and you can see I'm not just using the tip, I'm kind of squishing the brush onto the shell, and I'm following the curve of the shell with the broken china. Then I'm coming in from the opposite direction, and again I'm just swiping the brushed corduroy around the outside edge of the shell. Once you're happy with that, you quickly just wet your brush, so clean your brush off, and then drag it around that inside edge of the painted area, and that way you don't get a harsh line, you get a blended ink colour, so it's blending out towards the white. So it's not quite dark enough, so I'm just going over it once more, and then I'm cleaning off my brush and coming around that inside edge, and that just blends the ink out into nothing. And I just want to add a little bit more intensity to the blue along that bottom edge. So I'm going to show you that again. Sometimes it's difficult to describe what you do sort of naturally, and I do want to be able to get that over in this video. So I'm just swiping the blue around the outside edge along the stripe, and then coming in the opposite direction and actually overlapping towards the inside of the blue with the brown, and then cleaning off your brush and working along that inside edge just to blend it out with the water. So again, just darkening the brown slightly and blending it into the blue. Although I'm not going to use the lovely clamshells, I did think I would show you how I would colour those as well, because it's more or less the same technique. You can either choose to have the blue as the highlight in the centre of the shell, and I'm just creating a little sort of triangular fan shape because of the way the light would hit the shell, and then I'm coming back in on both sides with the brown, and then once I'm happy with that, I'm quickly washing off my brush, drying it slightly and just running it along that area where the two colours blend. So I'm not being precious about staying in the lines because I'm going to cut these shells out, but you could also do it by adding the brown to each side of the shell, and if you weren't going to use the blue, then whilst your paint is wet, then again take that clean brush and just blend that colour out towards the centre. And that way you create a highlight in the centre of your little clam shell. Look at all that lovely detail. Don't look at my nails. So I've just cut myself a mount for each of the two main pieces. So I've got a mount for the greeting and a mount for the actual main panel. And I've literally increased my inch measurement by just slightly over 1/8 of an inch, and I've done that for both pieces. And then if you're working in centimetres, I suggest about 4mm bigger, just to get that nice fine border. And then you're going to attach the pieces together using double-sided tape. So mounting the greeting centrally, and then mounting the background panel. So just thinking about the composition, I've tied a ribbon loosely around the card, and I am cutting out 5 of my little stripy shells. So these ones are nice and easy to cut out, and I'm just deciding whether to have 3 or 5, and I think I'm going to go for the full 5, but you could easily get away with 3 if you wanted to. I just like them, so I'm going to use 5. So just working out where I want the ribbon to sit on the panel, and then I'm going to use strong double-sided tape to attach the ends on the reverse of the cardstock. So I'm using strong double-sided tape to make sure the ribbon stays in place, and before I attach it, I'm going to make sure that the wording is the right way up. So starting at this end, I'm just going to press the ribbon into place and wrap it round the front of the card, just picking a little bit of the dark text. So I'm just repositioning the ribbon slightly so that I get some of the dark text on the front of the card. And I'm going to be tying a knot separately to the side of the sentiment. So roughly about there. So I'm just going to stop for a moment until I put my sentiment in position. So I'm going to mount the sentiment with foam pads. And once the sentiment's in position, then I'm trimming the knot to fit in the space that I've got left. And then I'm going to come in a second time, and again I'm just looking for a nice piece of text and then I'm going to add another strip of ribbon and just trimming the ends diagonally. And this whole panel is attached to the actual card front, again using foam pads. And as I turn this over, I'm wondering if you can spot my mistake. It wasn't until I was watching this back that I realised what I'd done, and I've switched the colours on my greeting panel upside down. So I must have done it when I was stamping the greeting originally. Doesn't look too bad, but it wasn't really what I intended. And so you can look out for that when you come to do this card. Make sure that you keep your little greeting panel the right way up when you stamp the word. I'm using a barbecue skewer just to curl over the very outside edge of the shells, just to give them a little bit of dimension. And you can do this with your fingers really, but I just think you get a little bit more of a defined curl by using the edge of the barbecue skewer. And then once you've shaped your shells, you're ready to stick them along the bottom of your card using foam pads. And I'm going to have them sitting up this way, and 5 just about fit nicely across the bottom edge of that card. So I'm positioning them first, and then I'm going to start in the centre and work my way out, making sure that I get a nice even spread of shells. And then I'm just attaching small pieces of foam tape to the back of the shells. So 2 outside edges first, and then 1 in the middle, and then finally the last 2 shells, making up a lovely border of shells along the bottom of the card. So I'm just checking that, oh look, nothing on the inside and no marks on the outside, which is quite an achievement for me. And I just thought when I was looking at this card, it just needed just something a little bit extra, and I'm going to add some of these enamel dots. You can get them from lots of different manufacturers, and I did start out by using these grey ones that you can see here, but I decided the dark brown ones looked better, so I'm just switching them over. I've got 1 in the middle of the bow, 3 little tiny ones on the greeting, and then 3 medium-sized ones down the side of the card. And I think that just makes a nice little finishing touch and just adds a little bit of sheen to the front of the card. So there it is, my first card and my first project for the Rubber Dance design team, and I've had great fun making this card, and I really hope that I've tempted you to go along to the Rubber Dance website to see what else is on offer over there. Like I said, I'll be sharing lots more projects with you over the coming weeks. I've had great fun. Look at the detail on that stamp. Even when it's shadow stamped, it doesn't lose any of that clarity. So stay tuned for the links to rubberdance.com, where you can go and purchase your set of stamps. I hope I've tempted you, because they've really been great fun to work with. And this set was Beach Sentiments BM1 6F, and I've had great fun on my first design team project. I hope you'll join me again soon for some more fun with Rubber Dance stamps. And until next time, thank you for watching.